December 1945 arrived without ceremony. The war was over, the flags were being folded away, and Europe was learning how to breathe again. For Winston Churchill, the silence was unfamiliar. He was no longer Prime Minister. No longer responsible for holding an alliance together with words chosen like explosives, powerful but dangerous if mishandled. History had finally loosened its grip on him. Then George S. Patton died. Not in battle. Not in triumph. But quietly, after victory had already been declared. A sudden end for a man who had lived at full speed. 12 days after a car accident on a German road, the most aggressive Allied commander of the war was gone. And with his death, something else disappeared. Consequences. During the war, everything Churchill said about Patton had been measured. Every sentence weighed against alliance politics, British pride, American sensitivities, and the fragile egos of commanders who all needed to believe they mattered equally. Patton was praised, but never elevated. Admired, but never unleashed. Useful, but always dangerous. Churchill understood why. He had lived the same contradiction himself. He knew that some men were too volatile to praise openly, too effective to discard, and too disruptive to leave unmanaged. Patton belonged to that rare category. The kind of man history needs in moments of collapse, but resists in moments of order. While the war raged, Churchill could not afford honesty. Words shaped morale. Words shaped alliances. Words shaped outcomes. Admitting too much about Patton would have fractured unity at the exact moment unity was survival. But after Patton's death, there was no alliance left to protect. No coalition to balance. No consequences left to fear. And in private conversations, reflections, and admissions never meant for headlines, Churchill finally allowed himself to acknowledge something he had long understood but never said aloud. That Patton was not merely effective. He was something rarer. Something history does not easily replace. This is the story of what Churchill finally admitted when silence became safe. Stay with me. Because to understand what Churchill admitted at the end, we first have to understand why he could never say it when it mattered most. During the war, Winston Churchill learned to speak in layers. Publicly, his words were confident, stirring, unifying. Privately, they were cautious, selective, and often incomplete. This was not duplicity. It was survival. An alliance as vast and fragile as the one fighting Nazi Germany could not withstand unfiltered truth, especially when that truth elevated one man too far above the others. George S. Patton was that man. From the moment Patton entered the European theater, Churchill understood the problem. Patton was not merely an American general. He was a force that distorted balance. His victories arrived too fast, too visibly, too decisively. In a coalition where perception mattered almost as much as results, Patton's success threatened to make others look slow, cautious, or unnecessary. Churchill could not afford that. The British war effort carried the weight of national pride. Britain had stood alone in 1940. It had endured the Blitz, held the line, and paid dearly for survival. Its commanders were not merely soldiers, they were symbols. Bernard Montgomery, meticulous and deliberate, embodied British discipline and control. To publicly praise Patton without restraint would have been to undermine that symbolism. So Churchill calibrated his words. When Patton succeeded in North Africa, Churchill spoke of teamwork. When Patton raced across Sicily, Churchill praised coordination. When Patton's forces reached objectives ahead of British units, Churchill emphasized planning, logistics, and collective effort. The message was consistent: no one man was decisive. The alliance was. Privately, Churchill knew better. He read the same reports as everyone else, but he read them differently. Where others saw Patton's recklessness, Churchill saw momentum. Where critics saw indiscipline, he saw pressure applied relentlessly to a crumbling enemy. Patton did not wait for perfection. He exploited hesitation. And against an enemy already stretched thin, that mattered enormously. But Churchill also understood Patton's danger. Patton did not adjust his personality to politics. He spoke as if war existed in a vacuum, untouched by diplomacy or public opinion. He insulted allies, dismissed caution, and treated restraint as weakness. These qualities made him terrifying to the enemy and exhausting to everyone else. For Churchill, the problem was not whether Patton was effective. The problem was that Patton could not be safely celebrated. Every word of praise carried consequences. Elevate Patton too openly, and British commanders would bristle. British newspapers would question why American generals seemed to dominate the narrative of victory. The alliance, built on mutual respect and careful compromise, would begin to crack. Churchill had seen alliances fail before. He would not allow that to happen again. The slapping incidents in Sicily offered a grim kind of relief. Not because Churchill approved of Patton's behavior, but because the controversy provided justification. It allowed restraint to be framed as moral necessity rather than political calculation. Public discipline restored balance. It reminded everyone that Patton, however brilliant, was flawed. Churchill supported Eisenhower's response, not because it diminished Patton, but because it preserved the alliance. Behind closed doors, Churchill's view was more nuanced. He did not excuse Patton's actions, but he did not dismiss his value either. He understood something uncomfortable. The qualities that made Patton politically dangerous were the same qualities that made him militarily extraordinary. War, Churchill believed, was not won by moderation. It was won by force applied at the right moment. Patton embodied that principle in its purest form. Yet Churchill could never say so openly. Every public statement had to serve a higher purpose. To maintain unity. To protect morale. To ensure that victory, when it came, would belong to everyone. That meant Patton had to remain contained, his reputation trimmed and reshaped for public consumption. This was not hypocrisy. It was leadership under constraint. Churchill admired Patton's energy but distrusted his lack of control. He respected his instincts but feared their consequences. He recognized his effectiveness but understood that celebrating it too loudly would destabilize the very structure holding the war together. So Churchill did what statesmen often do. He buried admiration beneath caution. He replaced honesty with balance. He praised just enough to acknowledge results, and restrained just enough to avoid fracture. Patton continued to fight. Churchill continued to manage perceptions. And between them existed an unspoken understanding. That some truths were too volatile to release while the war still hung in the balance. Only later, when victory was secured and consequences faded, would those truths begin to surface. If you think this restraint was frustrating, wait until you see how it shaped the war's most decisive moments. Because the cost of holding Patton back would soon become impossible to ignore. George Patton did not wage war the way alliances preferred it to be waged. He did not seek consensus. He did not wait for perfect coordination. He did not believe that caution deserved the same respect as courage. To Patton, speed was not recklessness. It was morality. Every hour gained was an hour the enemy lost, an hour fewer soldiers would die, an hour closer to collapse. Churchill understood this instinct instinctively. He had built his own reputation on urgency. On acting while others hesitated. On forcing decisions when delay felt safer. In Patton, Churchill recognized a familiar rhythm, though played at a far more dangerous tempo. From North Africa onward, Patton demonstrated a style of command that made traditional coordination look sluggish. His attacks came early, fast, and without apology. He exploited confusion before it could harden into resistance. German units did not have time to entrench. They reacted rather than planned. Churchill followed these campaigns closely. What impressed him most was not Patton's victories, but their psychological effect. German intelligence reports revealed anxiety whenever Patton's name appeared. Prisoners spoke of him not as a tactician, but as inevitability. He moved before defenses could form. He struck where no one expected him. The enemy did not fear Patton's plans. They feared his momentum. Sicily made the contrast impossible to ignore. While British forces advanced deliberately, securing objectives step by step, Patton pushed relentlessly west and then north. Roads clogged with retreating Germans. Towns fell in rapid succession. Patton's army did not pause to admire success. It converted success into acceleration. Churchill watched the map change daily and understood the dilemma forming beneath the victories. Patton's pace made coordination difficult. It embarrassed slower advances. It exposed the limits of careful planning when faced with raw motion. Yet Churchill also knew why Patton's style could not become the standard. Alliances are built on predictability. Supply lines, political agreements, and shared command structures require time to align. Patton treated those constraints as obstacles to be smashed rather than realities to be managed. That tension deepened in France. When Patton's Third Army finally broke free after Normandy, it became a living demonstration of everything he and Eisenhower had once theorized decades earlier. Armored columns surged across open terrain. German resistance dissolved under constant pressure. Entire formations collapsed not because they were defeated in detail, but because they were never allowed to stabilize. Churchill admired the results even as he worried about the implications. Patton's army advanced so quickly that it consumed fuel faster than planners could supply it. Requests became demands. Demands became arguments. Coordination with neighboring forces became an afterthought. Patton saw opportunity everywhere and resented anything that slowed him down. For Churchill, this was the price of Patton's genius. He did not merely push boundaries. He ignored them. British commanders, trained to value method and control, found Patton infuriating. Montgomery in particular represented the opposite philosophy. He sought certainty before action. He preferred overwhelming force applied at a chosen moment. Patton preferred continuous motion, trusting chaos to break the enemy before it broke him. Churchill stood between these philosophies, forced to balance them publicly while privately recognizing that they were not equal in every situation. Speed wins wars of movement. Caution wins wars of endurance. The problem was knowing which war was being fought at any given moment. Patton believed the war in Europe was a race. Every delay gave the enemy time to recover. Every pause created new resistance. Churchill, watching from London and later from the sidelines of power, could not entirely disagree. But he also understood that Patton's approach left wreckage behind. Coordination suffered. Allies felt sidelined. Political agreements, especially those involving post-war boundaries, strained under Patton's indifference. This was why Patton could never be allowed to set the tone for the entire alliance. His genius was situational. Devastating in motion. Dangerous in structure. Churchill admired Patton precisely because he did not belong in consensus. He belonged in moments where decision mattered more than agreement. Where speed mattered more than harmony. But wars are not fought only at the front. They are fought in conference rooms, negotiations, and planning sessions where Patton's instincts became liabilities. So Churchill watched, admired, restrained, and waited. He knew Patton would eventually be needed in exactly the kind of crisis alliances fear most. A moment when plans failed, lines collapsed, and speed became the only answer. That moment was coming. If you think Patton was being held back unfairly, the next chapter shows how restraint nearly became catastrophe, and why even Churchill began to question the price of caution. By the summer of 1944, restraint had become policy. It was no longer an instinctive balancing act or an unspoken understanding. It was deliberate, structured, and enforced. George Patton was no longer merely a general to be managed. He was a problem to be contained. Churchill watched this shift with growing unease. The success in Normandy had opened France, but the war did not accelerate the way Patton believed it should. Momentum slowed. Supplies were redistributed. Priorities changed. Instead of exploiting collapse, the Allies began consolidating it. Instead of racing forward, they paused to align. Patton felt it immediately. Fuel was rationed. Ammunition allocations tightened. His Third Army, once surging, was forced to idle while other operations took precedence. To Patton, this was madness. The German army was reeling. Its command structure was fractured. Retreat had turned into disorder. Every instinct Patton possessed screamed that this was the moment to finish it. Churchill could see the logic. He followed reports that described German units barely holding together, formations dissolving under pressure, commanders unable to establish coherent defenses. Patton's rapid advances had created exactly the conditions military theorists dreamed of. And then, just as suddenly, that pressure eased. Not because Patton had failed, but because restraint demanded it. Churchill understood why. The alliance had commitments. British forces required priority for major operations. Political agreements with the Soviets loomed in the background. The war was no longer just about defeating Germany. It was about shaping the world that would follow. Patton did not care about any of that. He saw only the present battlefield. Only the opportunity directly in front of him. He did not believe wars were won by preparing for peace. He believed they were won by destroying the enemy's ability to resist. Churchill sympathized with that view more than he admitted. As supplies were diverted, Patton's frustration turned into fury. He argued. He protested. He warned that hesitation would cost lives. That allowing the enemy time to regroup was a mistake history would not forgive. Churchill read these exchanges with a growing sense of dread. Not because Patton was wrong, but because Patton was too right to be safely unleashed. The decision to prioritize Operation Market Garden only deepened the tension. Montgomery's plan was ambitious, elegant, and politically appealing. It promised a clean breakthrough and a swift end to the war. It also required enormous resources that Patton desperately needed. Churchill supported the operation publicly. Privately, doubts lingered. Market Garden failed. The cost was severe. Momentum stalled. German resistance hardened. Opportunities Patton had warned about vanished. Churchill did not say it aloud, but the question began to haunt him. Had restraint gone too far? Had caution replaced judgment? Churchill was no stranger to regret. He had seen it before. Gallipoli lingered in his memory like a scar. He knew what it felt like to misread the moment. To hesitate when boldness was required. Watching Patton restrained while opportunity slipped away stirred that old unease. Still, restraint remained. Patton's reputation made him politically radioactive. His words could derail negotiations. His instincts ignored diplomacy. And yet, Churchill could not escape the growing realization that the alliance was depending on conditions remaining stable. Wars rarely oblige. As autumn turned to winter, intelligence reports grew darker. German forces, battered but not broken, were reorganizing. Reserves were shifting. Commanders spoke of desperation measures. Churchill felt the pressure building again, the sense that history was preparing another test. Patton sensed it too. He warned repeatedly that the enemy was not finished. That German collapse was being assumed rather than ensured. That winter would bring surprises. His warnings were noted, filed, and largely dismissed. Restraint, after all, had become habit. Churchill, now increasingly sidelined from direct command decisions, could only watch. He had advocated balance for years. Now he wondered if balance had become blindness. The alliance had built its success on coordination, planning, and restraint. But those same virtues were beginning to dull its edge. The war had changed again, and the machinery of restraint was slow to adapt. When the blow finally came, it would come where restraint felt safest. And when that moment arrived, the alliance would turn, almost instinctively, to the one man it had spent months holding back. The next chapter reveals the crisis that shattered restraint completely, and the moment when leaders stopped asking for consensus and asked only one question: who can move now? The morning of December 16, 1944 arrived without warning. Snow fell softly across the Ardennes forest, muffling sound, blurring movement, disguising intent. Beneath that quiet, the German army struck with a force the Allies believed no longer possible. Entire American units were caught off guard. Communications collapsed. Front lines bent, then broke. For the first time since Normandy, defeat no longer felt theoretical. Churchill understood the danger immediately. This was not merely a setback. It was the kind of moment where wars change direction. Where confidence evaporates. Where alliances are tested not by planning, but by shock. The German offensive threatened to split Allied lines and shatter momentum just as victory seemed inevitable. The old assumptions failed all at once. Careful coordination did not matter if there was nothing left to coordinate. Methodical advances meant nothing if the front collapsed faster than plans could adjust. What mattered now was speed. Direction. Pressure applied immediately. An emergency conference was called at Verdun. Commanders gathered under grim conditions, maps spread across tables already outdated by the hour. Reports arrived incomplete, contradictory, alarming. The mood was heavy with uncertainty. Churchill followed developments closely, understanding that this was the moment restraint had prepared for without intending to. Defensive proposals filled the room. Pull back. Hold positions. Buy time. Wait for reinforcements. Sensible ideas. Safe ideas. Ideas built for stability. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. The question was simple. The implication was not. How long would it take to attack? Patton did not hesitate. He had anticipated this moment long before it arrived. During the journey to Verdun, he had already wargamed the scenario. He knew the terrain. He knew the weather. He knew the risks. More importantly, he knew the cost of delay. 72 hours. 3 divisions. The room fell silent. What Patton proposed bordered on the impossible. His Third Army was engaged far to the south. To strike the German flank, he would have to disengage completely, pivot his entire force 90 degrees, and advance through winter conditions into an enemy offensive already in motion. Most commanders would have asked for weeks. Patton asked for permission. Eisenhower gave it. Churchill recognized the significance instantly. This was the moment restraint had been waiting for. The moment when all the caution, all the containment, all the political calculation was discarded in favor of one brutal requirement. Someone had to act faster than events. Patton delivered. Within hours, orders went out. Columns turned north. Supply lines stretched to breaking. Roads clogged with armor and transport fighting snow, ice, and exhaustion. There was no room for hesitation. Patton's army moved because it had to. On December 22, exactly as promised, Patton's division slammed into the German southern flank. The effect was immediate. The German advance faltered. Momentum slowed. Pressure shifted. What had looked like collapse transformed into resistance. Then into recovery. Then into reversal. The German offensive, so carefully prepared, unraveled under sudden counter-pressure it could not absorb. The crisis passed. Churchill absorbed the reports with a mixture of relief and clarity. This was the truth restraint could no longer hide. When systems failed, when planning collapsed, when stability vanished, Patton became indispensable. Not because he was reckless. Because he was prepared to move without certainty. The alliance had survived the Ardennes not through careful coordination, but through decisive violence applied at exactly the right moment. Patton had done what others could not because he thought differently. Where others saw obstacles, he saw movement. Where others needed alignment, he needed direction. Churchill did not celebrate publicly. He understood too well the dangers of elevating Patton now. But privately, the lesson settled deep. This was why Patton had been worth managing. Every apology. Every restraint. Every political cost. Patton was not meant for stability. He was meant for collapse. For moments when everything that had been carefully built began to fail. The alliance emerged intact because, when it mattered most, it had finally stopped holding him back. If you think this moment changed how leaders saw Patton, the next chapter shows what happened once the war ended, and why honesty only became possible after he was gone. Victory did not bring clarity. It brought silence. By the summer of 1945, the war that had demanded everything from its leaders was finished. The machinery of alliance began to dismantle itself. Commanders returned home. Armies demobilized. The urgency that had justified restraint faded, replaced by a new and unforgiving reality. Peace had rules of its own. George Patton did not adapt to them. The traits that had made him indispensable in crisis became liabilities overnight. His impatience with politics, his blunt language, his refusal to soften instinct into diplomacy all worked against him. Statements that might have been overlooked in war became scandals in peace. Opinions once tolerated as battlefield bravado were now politically toxic. Churchill, no longer Prime Minister, watched this transformation from the outside. He had lost power, but not perspective. He understood how quickly wartime virtues could turn into peacetime dangers. He had lived that transition himself more than once. Patton, however, did not moderate. He remained exactly what he had always been. And that made him impossible to keep. Patton's removal from command was quiet, deliberate, and final. There was no grand dismissal, no dramatic confrontation. Just reassignment, isolation, and distance from influence. The man who had pivoted an army in 72 hours was reduced to administrative irrelevance. Churchill recognized the cruelty of it, even as he acknowledged its necessity. Then came the accident. A routine drive. A collision. Injuries that did not initially seem fatal. 12 days later, Patton was dead. The news carried none of the drama that had followed him through the war. It arrived as a fact, not a spectacle. And with it, something changed. Patton's death removed the last political restraint. There was no longer a need to manage his reputation, to protect alliances, or to guard against his words. The man was gone. What remained was truth. Churchill began to speak differently. Not in speeches. Not in public statements. But in private conversations, letters, and reflections shared with those who understood the weight of command. Freed from responsibility, he allowed himself honesty. He admitted that Patton possessed a quality that could not be taught or replaced. Speed of mind. Speed of decision. A willingness to act without the comfort of consensus. Churchill had seen many commanders in his life. Few had that combination. He acknowledged that restraining Patton had been politically necessary, but militarily costly. That opportunities had been lost not because Patton was wrong, but because the alliance could not risk letting him be right too often. Churchill did not romanticize Patton. He did not deny the damage Patton could cause. But he admitted something far more revealing. That in moments of chaos, Patton functioned where others froze. That when plans collapsed, Patton imposed direction through will alone. This was not praise born of nostalgia. It was assessment. Churchill had built his career on recognizing moments when ordinary leadership failed. In Patton, he saw a man built specifically for those moments. Unmanageable in peace. Uncomfortable in stability. Essential in crisis. Patton's death forced Churchill to confront a truth he had avoided. That leadership sometimes requires harnessing dangerous personalities rather than eliminating them. That managing genius is often harder, and more important, than replacing it. In the months that followed, Churchill reflected on the cost of that management. the compromises, the silences, the calculated restraint. He did not regret them. But he acknowledged their price. Patton, in the end, had been used precisely as much as the alliance dared. No more. No less. And Churchill wondered, quietly, whether daring more might have changed the length, if not the outcome, of the war. These were thoughts that could only exist after the war, after power, after consequence. Patton's death made honesty safe. The final chapter brings all of this together, revealing what Churchill ultimately admitted about Patton, and what it teaches us about leadership when the cost of truth is too high to pay in real time. In the end, Winston Churchill's admission was not a single sentence. It was a reckoning. It emerged slowly, in fragments, in the way truths often do when they have been suppressed for too long. In private conversations. In reflections shared with those who understood the weight of command. In the quiet space that followed power, when words no longer needed to be weapons. Churchill admitted that George S. Patton had been indispensable. That word mattered. Indispensable did not mean flawless. It did not mean admirable in every respect. It meant irreplaceable. It meant that no other commander could have done exactly what Patton did when circumstances demanded it. Churchill understood the gravity of that admission. He had spent the war insisting, publicly, that no single man was essential. That victory belonged to institutions, to alliances, to collective effort. That belief had not been false. But it had not been complete. Patton represented the exception. Churchill acknowledged that Patton's value lay not in careful planning, but in momentum. Not in consensus, but in decision. Not in diplomacy, but in pressure. These were not traits celebrated in peacetime leadership. They were tolerated, barely, in wartime leadership. But they were decisive when everything else failed. He admitted that restraining Patton had been a political necessity rather than a military one. That many of the limits placed on him were designed to protect the alliance, not to improve battlefield outcomes. Churchill did not condemn those decisions. He had supported them at the time. But with distance came clarity. He wondered whether the war might have ended sooner had Patton been given greater freedom. This was not speculation meant for history books. It was a private question, asked by a man who understood that leadership is often about choosing which costs to accept. Churchill had chosen stability over speed. Unity over momentum. Those choices had won the war. But they had also prolonged it. Patton, Churchill concluded, thrived in chaos. He did not create it deliberately, but he operated within it naturally. Where others sought certainty, Patton accepted uncertainty as the price of action. That made him dangerous. It also made him effective. Churchill recognized something else as well. Patton could not have been left unchecked. His instincts, if unleashed without restraint, would have produced diplomatic disasters. He would have alienated allies, undermined negotiations, and possibly fractured the coalition that made victory possible. This was the paradox at the heart of Patton's legacy. Left unmanaged, he was destructive. Properly directed, he was unstoppable. Churchill admitted that managing Patton had been one of the war's quiet burdens. It required constant vigilance, constant mediation, constant apology. It demanded that leaders protect Patton from himself while extracting every ounce of his effectiveness. That burden, Churchill understood, was the true cost of genius. In his later reflections, Churchill spoke of leadership not as command, but as containment. Of knowing when to unleash force and when to restrain it. Of recognizing that the most powerful tools are often the hardest to control. Patton was one of those tools. Churchill did not envy Eisenhower for having to manage him. He respected him for it. He knew that few leaders could have balanced Patton's aggression with alliance politics without breaking one or the other. What Churchill ultimately admitted was not simply that Patton had been right more often than he was allowed to be. It was that history sometimes advances because of men who cannot exist comfortably within its structures. Patton was built for war in its most chaotic form. For moments when hesitation meant defeat. For crises where action mattered more than approval. He was not built for peace. And peace, once it arrived, had no use for him. Churchill understood that too late to change it. The lesson he drew was not sentimental. It was sobering. That leadership often requires silencing truths until the moment they can be safely spoken. That history is shaped as much by what leaders cannot say as by what they do. Only after Patton was gone could Churchill admit the full measure of his value. Not because Patton had changed, but because the consequences of honesty had finally disappeared. And in that admission lies the quiet tragedy of extraordinary men. They are often needed most when they are least tolerable. Celebrated only when they can no longer disrupt the world that used them. George S. Patton was one of those men. Churchill knew it. He had always known it. But only after Patton died could he finally say it out loud. Do you think leaders should unleash extraordinary individuals even when they threaten stability, or was restraint the only path to victory? Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more untold truths from history's most complicated relationships.